Um, Imagine you're standing on the sidewalk in a really bustling city, and you're craning your neck to look up at this brand new, like 90-story skyscraper.
Oh, wow. Just a massive building.
Right. It's an absolute marvel of engineering. But now, imagine you get a chance to walk into the actual architect's office.
Okay.
And unrolled across this massive oak table is the original blueprint. When you look closely at that paper, there is a very strict expectation of order.
Like a legend in the corner.
Exactly. Yeah, down in the bottom corner, there's a legend. A solid line means a load-bearing wall. A dotted line means electrical wiring. A crosshatch means plumbing.
Right. The basics of reading any architectural plan.
Right, the architect created that legend. And if you want to understand why the building doesn't just, collapse in the wind, you have to read their specific legend.
You can't just ignore it.
No, you can't just walk onto the active construction site with a sledgehammer, point it at a solid line, and say, well, in my personal modern culture, a solid line is just a light suggestion.
Right. Like, I'm just going to knock this wall down to make an open concept living room.
Exactly. If you do that...
Well, if you do that, you aren't just making a controversial design choice. I mean, you are guaranteeing a catastrophic collapse.
Yeah.
Because you're completely abandoning the internal logic of the original designer. You're superimposing an entirely different foreign legend onto a pre-existing architecture.
The building doesn't care.
Exactly. The building won't care about your cultural redefinition of the lines. Gravity is just going to take over.
And that tension, that profound friction between an ancient original legend and a modern cultural interpretation, that is the foundation of our deep dive into the source material today.
It really is.
So welcome. We have a text in front of us today that is dense, it's intellectually relentless, and it's fundamentally about architecture.
But not physical buildings, obviously.
Right, not steel and glass. We're talking about moral, theological, and bodily architecture. The source text we are unpacking is this formidable essay titled The Berean Spine, Restoring the Scriptural Witness of Nature.
Which is quite a title.
It is. And as we get into this, you listening right now, you are going to realize very quickly that we are stepping into some deeply challenging territory.
We absolutely are. I mean, the author of this text is presenting a massive interlocking framework. It details exactly how the biblical text defines the baseline concepts of human existence.
Like nature, sexuality, gender, life itself.
Yeah. And these are not abstract, dusty academic topics. These are the absolute flashpoints of modern society right now.
Which means, honestly, we need to lay our cards on the table before we go a single step further.
Absolutely. Ground rules.
Yeah, because you might be listening to this on your commute, or maybe you're walking the dog, and you might have very strong, very personal convictions about abortion, LGBTQ issues, gender roles, or just the ethics of modern civilization in general.
And that's completely natural.
Right. But we want to be incredibly clear with you here. Our goal today is not to tell you who is right.
No, not at all.
We are not here to endorse a political platform or to champion a specific theology or, validate one side of the culture war.
We're totally neutral. Think of us strictly as cartographers today.
Ooh, I like that.
Yeah, our job is just to walk you through the map this author has drawn. We're going to point out the major landmarks and explain the engineering of their arguments.
Right. You might find yourself nodding along vigorously, or you might find your blood pressure spiking, like vehemently disagreeing with the premise.
Either reaction is fine.
Totally fine. Either way, our mission is that by the end of this deep dive, you will understand the deep underlying logic of how the author constructed this framework.
And that cartographer analogy is vital, I think, because it actually mirrors the author's own methodology in the text.
Oh, how so?
Well, their author builds this entire framework on a concept they call the Berean approach.
Okay, the Berean approach, what is that?
It's a direct reference to a group of people in the biblical narrative. The Bereans were historically commended because they refused to be swept away by emotional rhetoric or just modern slogans.
So they were fact checkers, essentially.
Basically, yes. When someone made a claim, they went back to the original source texts. They searched the scriptures daily to see if the internal logic actually held up. And the author adopts this as an uncompromising rule for engaging with ancient texts.
And this leads to a linguistic theory in the text that I found just completely fascinating.
The empty containers.
Yes. The author spends a significant amount of time critiquing how modern people interact with ancient words, introducing this idea of empty containers. Can you break down how the author views our modern vocabulary problem.
Yeah, it's a brilliant critique of how language evolves, or, well, maybe devolves in public debate.
Right.
The author argues that modern dissenters, specifically those who wish to move away from traditional biblical sexual ethics, they rely on a very specific linguistic tactic. They take a broad, ancient biblical word, something like sexual immorality, and they completely detach it from the historical body of the text.
They just hollow it out.
Exactly. They hollow it out. They treat it like an empty container. And once it's empty, they simply pour their own 21st century cultural preferences, comforts, and definitions right into that ancient container.
Wow. Okay, let me make sure I'm wrapping my head around this.
Sure.
The author is suggesting that a modern reader looks at a word like immorality, and their internal monologue goes something like, well, I live in a modern culture that says this specific physical action is completely consensual, loving, and highly moral.
Right.
Therefore, when this ancient biblical text says immorality, it couldn't possibly be referring to this action.
Yes.
So they're essentially backdating a modern dictionary to override an ancient text.
That is the exact mechanism the author is trying to dismantle here. The text insists on a very rigid rule of interpretation. Scripture defines Scripture. God's earlier speech governs the later categories. So, if the text has already spent centuries naming an action, defining its boundaries, passing judgment on it early in the narrative, a broad summary word used much later on does not erase all that prior, highly specific naming.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, the author uses a phrase that functions as kind of the heartbeat of this entire essay. They say generalized does not mean undefined.
Generalized does not mean undefined. That is the legend on the blueprint right there.
Exactly.
Words are gathered categories. They are full of history.
Yeah.
So if we want to understand this spine the author is building, we can't start by analyzing modern political debates on the evening news.
No, you'd be starting at the end.
Right.
Yeah.
And surprisingly, the author insists we can't even start with the Apostle Paul's writings in the New Testament. To understand the architecture, we have to go back to the very first lines of the drafting table. We have to go to the book of Genesis.
And that's because the entire weight of this essay rests on one single, heavily contested word.
Which is?
Nature.
Nature. Okay.
Yeah, later in the biblical narrative, specifically in Romans chapter 1, the text talks about human beings doing things that are, quote, against nature.
Right. That's a famous passage.
It is. But the author's foundational argument here is that you cannot possibly know what constitutes an act against nature until you have meticulously studied how the original architect defined nature in the first place.
Because you can't identify a structural failure if you don't know what a structurally sound pillar looks like.
Exactly. And Genesis is where nature is established.
I want to spend some serious time here because the author zeroes in on something very specific, how Genesis defines woman.
Yes, this is a crucial part of the essay.
Before the text even touches the controversies of Romans 1, it anchors itself in Genesis 2:18, and it introduces a Hebrew phrase that feels like the linchpin for everything that follows.
Ezer kenegdo.
Ezer kenegdo. Break that down for us.
So this is where the linguistic depth of the author's argument really begins to show. The author breaks down the etymology and historical context of this phrase to expose the original blueprint of a woman's nature.
Because in the ancient world, things were pretty grim.
Oh, absolutely. In the ancient Near East, women were frequently categorized simply as property. They were secondary citizens, or they were defined primarily by their reproductive utility.
Right.
But the author argues that Genesis radically rejects this. Woman is not introduced into the biblical narrative as a sexual object. She is not introduced as a piece of property to be traded.
Yeah, the text is very clear on that.
She is not introduced as mere breeding equipment, or what the author sharply, almost painfully, calls male access flesh.
Male access flesh. I mean, that phrase stopped me in my tracks when I read the source material.
It's intense.
It's jarring. But it highlights exactly what the author is fighting against.
Right.
So if we strip away the historical objectification, what does Ezer kenegdo actually mean in the original Hebrew context?
It translates roughly to the corresponding counterpart, or the face-to-face strength.
Face-to-face strength.
Yeah. The word Izer is often translated as helper in older English Bibles, which is unfortunate because it carried this connotation of a subordinate assistant.
Like an intern grabbing coffee for the boss.
Exactly, like a sidekick. But in Hebrew, Ezer is a word of profound power. I mean, it is frequently used elsewhere in the Bible to describe God himself coming to rescue humanity.
Oh, wow. So it's not a weak word at all.
Not at all. It is a strength that saves. And kenegdo means face-to-face, eye-to-eye, suitable, and corresponding. It implies an absolute equality of essence.
Okay, so it's a strength that meets strength,
Mm-hmm.
standing face to face, not a dynamic of one standing over and the other cowering under.
Precisely.
Let's go back to our skyscraper analogy for a second.
Mm-hmm.
If you're building this massive theological structure, Ezer Kenegdo is not just a decorative sconce you hang in the hallway to make things look pretty.
Right.
It is a massive, concrete, load-bearing pillar. It is structurally indispensable. If you remove it, or if you treat it like it's just drywall, the entire building compromises.
And this is where the author sets a brilliant, highly unexpected philosophical trap.
Yes, I was waiting to get to this part.
Usually when you read an essay defending traditional biblical ethics, you expect the author to aim all their rhetorical firepower exclusively at progressive or liberal theology.
Right, that's the usual dynamic.
But the author pivots here. They aim directly at what they call conservative dissenters.
I found this section completely captivating because it just upends the usual culture war binary. The author basically sets up a tripwire for certain conservative arguments that focus purely on submission or utility.
Yep.
Walk us through how the author uses Ezer Kenegdo to shut down a specific type of conservative reading.
So the author looks ahead to Romans 1:26. That's the famous verse where Paul writes about women exchanging their natural use. The author argues that if a conservative theologian or commentator reads that verse and defines a woman's natural use as mere sexual availability to a man.
Like if they reduce her fundamental nature to being a repository for male desire or purely reproductive machinery.
Exactly. If they do that, that commentator has already fundamentally failed the Genesis test.
The text calls this the shutoff valve. If your theology, however conservative you claim it to be, defines a woman merely as an object for male utility, you have reduced the woman beneath the profound nature God actually assigned to her.
You've stripped away her status as NgaiRuachZacharyDavidEnfieldJesusChrist.
Yeah, you've taken that load-bearing pillar of corresponding strength and treated it like disposable scaffolding.
The author is completely unyielding on this point. I mean, the logic is ironclad within this framework. Because her created nature in Genesis is a face-to-face counterpart, her natural use in Romans cannot possibly be reduced to mere sexual utility or subordinate property.
Right.
But the text doesn't stop there. The author realizes that navigating this requires walking a razor-thin ridge.
Because there's a danger of overcorrecting.
Exactly. Because immediately after establishing that she isn't just a reproductive machine, the text has to address the undeniable biological and theological reality of fruitfulness.
Right, because if you say women are not just breeding equipment, modern culture often takes that to mean, therefore, the biological reality of bearing life is irrelevant to a woman's nature.
Yes.
How does the author balance this?
By returning to the original mandate in Genesis, be fruitful and multiply. The author argues that fruitfulness is an inescapable, glorious part of the created order. The essay uses a deeply evocative phrase here, describing the womb not as an industrial machine, but as a sacred capacity.
A sacred capacity. So on one side of the ridge, you have the devastating error of objectification, reducing a woman to a walking incubator.
Right.
And then on the other side of the ridge, you have the error of despising fruitfulness, treating the capacity to bear human life as a burden, like a biological glitch, or something to be chemically suppressed as contrary to freedom.
Exactly. The author seems to be arguing that the cure for objectifying women isn't to hate the concept of fruitfulness.
It's to restore the full, integrated dignity of Ezer Kenegdo, the honored counterpart who possesses life-bearing glory.
That integration is the necessary prerequisite for the text's next major argumentative leap.
Okay, where do we go next?
Because if we have now firmly established that woman is fundamentally a corresponding counterpart endowed with sacred capacity, we have to ask the logical next question.
Which is?
What happens historically and culturally when that created order is violated? And this brings us out of Genesis and directly into the concept of exchange in Romans chapter 1.
The concept of the exchange. Yeah, the author points out that the entire rhetorical structure of Romans 1 is built on the tragedy of terrible trades.
Yeah, these terrible, unequal trades.
Right. Humanity exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images. They exchanged the truth of God for a lie. They exchanged the creator for the creature.
It's a cascading series of trades.
Yeah, where something of infinite foundational value is swapped for a cheap, destructive counterfeit.
Which leads the text to Romans 1:26, which is arguably one of the most fiercely debated verses in the history of modern theology.
Definitely.
Paul writes that females exchanged the natural use for what is against nature.
Right.
Having spent all this time establishing what nature actually is through the lens of Genesis, the author asks a pivotal question: what specific kind of exchange is Paul exposing here?
And the answer the author provides is historically massive. It's not just a narrow critique of individual actions. The text claims this exchange encompasses the entire historical reversal of Ezer Kenegdo into subjugation.
Think about the philosophical weight of that argument. The author is suggesting that one of the most devastating systemic exchanges against nature in human history is the institution of dominative patriarchy itself.
Wow.
It is the tragic trade of the counterpart for property. It is the face-to-face equality being twisted and deformed into an over-under hierarchy of domination.
It is corresponding, rescuing strength being reduced to a sexual object.
Exactly.
The text states this so clearly. It says, the woman made to stand with man was treated as beneath man. That is against nature.
It points back to Genesis 3:16.
Right, the narrative of the fall of humanity, where rule, domination, and twisted desire first enter the human story. The author is explicitly clear that this domination is the wound of a fallen world, not the Edenic ideal.
Yeah, it's a symptom of the break.
So when human history takes a woman and makes her subordinate property, or treats her body as disposable, that isn't just bad cultural practice. In the author's framework, that is the literal definition of nature violated.
It's a profound structural move. The author is reclaiming Romans 1:26 from being read purely as a narrow text about sexual orientation,
They're expanding it.
expanding it to indict the entire historical degradation of women. But once that framework is established, once the nature of woman as counterpart and life-bearer is solidified, the author drives this logic straight into the most volatile debate in modern civilization.
The ethics of abortion.
Yes.
This is where the tension really ratchets up. The author connects Genesis and Romans 1 directly to the womb. The argument goes like this. If a woman's created order undeniably includes life-bearing fruitfulness, that sacred capacity we discussed, then the act of abortion belongs directly and unavoidably inside the Romans 1:26 exchange pattern.
Let's trace the causality of the author's logic here because it's very tight.
Okay.
Premise 1, fruitfulness is nature. Premise 2, life-bearing is nature. Right. Premise 3, the womb receiving, sheltering, and nourishing life is the apex of the created order.
Right.
Therefore, the conclusion is that the deliberate, intentional destruction of unborn life is the ultimate reversal of that order and is the ultimate exchange.
It is trading the life-bearing nature for an intentional infliction of death.
Yes.
Now, you and I both know that whenever this philosophical argument is presented in the public square, there's an immediate, highly emotional counter-argument that gets raised.
Oh, invariably.
And the author anticipates it perfectly. People often bring up the tragic reality of miscarriage. The argument usually goes, well, if the loss of a pregnancy is so contrary to nature, what about miscarriages? They happen naturally, sometimes frequently. Doesn't the biological reality of miscarriage prove that the womb doesn't always protect life, and therefore ending a pregnancy isn't an unnatural act?
That's the standard counter-argument.
I really want to pause and unpack how the text handles this, because the author draws a surgical, defining line between miscarriage and abortion.
The author writes with immense care here. They state, a miscarriage is not abortion. That distinction must be clean.
Oh, okay. How do they distinguish it?
Within the theological framework of the text, miscarriage is defined as natural death. It is an involuntary loss, a heartbreaking grief suffered under the reality of a fallen, broken creation where bodies fail.
Because bodies fail all the time in a fallen world.
Right. Abortion, by stark contrast, is defined as intentional killing. It is the deliberate, calculated interruption and destruction of unborn life.
The quote is, miscarriage is death suffered, abortion is death inflicted.
It's very sharp.
That is a hauntingly precise distillation of the author's viewpoint. It completely shifts the vernacular of the debate.
And the author uses this sharp distinction to spring a logical trap on opposing arguments.
How so?
The text insists that a dissenter cannot hide behind the tragedy of miscarriage to philosophically defend the act of abortion.
Why not?
Because a miscarriage is not the womb deliberately choosing to destroy its own child. As the author powerfully states, natural death does not justify intentional killing.
Wow.
You cannot look at a biological tragedy, a failure of the body, and use it as a moral shield to justify a deliberate, premeditated action.
It's a devastating analogy when you think about it in other medical contexts.
Yeah.
It's like saying, well, human beings die of natural heart attacks all the time. Hearts fail.
Right.
Therefore, premeditated violence against someone's heart is morally acceptable because the heart stops naturally anyway.
Exactly. The logic just collapses under its own weight. The causal link is totally broken.
It really is.
And the author synthesizes these two massive protections into a dual shield. The text essentially says, Ezer Kenegdo protects the born from being objectified as a mere tool for men.
Okay.
And fruitfulness protects the unborn child from being destroyed. If you claim Romans 1:26 is only about same-sex acts and ignore the subjugation of women, you overclaim the text.
Right.
If you make natural use mean only sex, you objectify women. But critically, if you deny that abortion belongs to the female exchange against nature, you empty the glory of fruitfulness completely out of the creation narrative.
The author is holding a vice grip on this entire spine. You don't get to pick and choose which vertebrae you like based on your political leanings.
Nope.
Woman is the equal counterpart, fruitfulness is a sacred biological reality, and deliberate killing is categorically, philosophically different from natural death. It is a sealed, airtight loop of logic.
It is remarkably consistent, but as the author transitions from analyzing Romans 1:26 to Romans 1:27, the essay confronts a significant, undeniable shift in the actual vocabulary of the biblical text.
Okay, what changes?
Well, while verse 26 addresses the female exchange, broadly focusing on the departure from natural use, verse 27 shifts to the male exchange.
Right.
And here, the biblical language loses its broadness and becomes highly uncomfortably explicit.
Right. Romans 1:27 says, likewise also, and then specifically, graphically mentions males with males.
Yes.
The author points out that verse 27 is brutally explicit about male with male desire and action, whereas verse 26 did not state women with that exact matching directness.
This is a crucial moment of intellectual honesty in the essay, and it perfectly illustrates the Berean method the author demands.
They actually admit a lack of symmetry.
Yes. The author states plainly that the ancient Torah, specifically Leviticus 18:22 and 20:13, calls male with male intercourse an abomination.
Right. It's very clear there.
It is direct, undeniable, statutory, legal wording. But the author openly admits that the Torah does not provide a matching, symmetrical, explicit female with female statute in that exact same legal phrasing.
I read this part, and honestly, I was surprised. You rarely see this level of textual concession in modern debates.
You really don't.
The author literally writes, Scripture should not be defended by exaggerating Scripture.
It's a great line.
That is a massive challenge to anyone who tries to force the biblical text to be perfectly symmetrical when, historically and linguistically, it simply isn't.
Right.
The author is saying, we have to be honest map makers. We can't draw a road on the map just because we think it makes the map look more balanced or makes our argument easier. We have to map only what is actually there.
The author refuses to manufacture fake evidence. However, the text argues that Leviticus itself provides the solution to this lack of symmetry.
How? If there's no matching verse?
Not through a matching verse, but through what the author calls boundary architecture.
Boundary architecture, okay.
The argument is that Leviticus 18 isn't just a haphazard list of random, disconnected Bronze Age rules thrown together.
Which is how a lot of modern readers see it.
Right. They see it as this arbitrary list. But the author says it is a highly cohesive, deeply intentional holiness map. Think of it like a municipal zoning map for human behavior.
Okay, I love this concept of a behavioral zoning map. Let's explore the topography of this map.
Let's do it.
If I am looking at Leviticus 18 through the author's architectural lens, what are the different zones? What are the specific boundaries being drawn in the sand?
The author identifies several distinct overlapping boundaries that Leviticus 18 is designed to fiercely protect.
Give me some examples.
Well, it addresses the prohibition of incest, which violates the fundamental boundary of the family.
Okay.
It addresses adultery, which violates the boundary of the marriage covenant.
Right.
It addresses male with male intercourse, which the text views as violating the created boundary of sex. It addresses bestiality, which violates the boundary of the human species.
Okay, so family, marriage, sex, species.
And crucially, seemingly out of nowhere, it addresses the act of giving children to Molech.
Okay, wait, giving children to Molech, that violates both the boundary of worship and the boundary of life, right?
Exactly.
I'm going to stop on that last one. For anyone listening who might not be familiar with ancient Near Eastern history, Molech was a Canaanite deity associated with the horrific practice of child sacrifice.
It's incredibly dark.
It is. The author points out something incredibly chilling about the layout of this text. Right in the middle of a chapter entirely dedicated to sexual prohibitions, God abruptly forbids offering children to Molech.
The placement is not an accident. Leviticus 18:21 is positioned right beside 18:22.
Just structurally right next to it?
Yes. The author argues this adjacency proves a profound theological point. The child is not disposable material for a false altar.
Wow.
And the text connects this ancient barbaric practice directly, without hesitation, to the modern infrastructure of abortion. It argues that despite the millennia between them, they share the exact same structural architecture.
The quote from the text is jarring. It says, modern abortion may not use the ancient name of Molech, but the structure is exactly the same, the offering up of children to another authority.
And then it lists those modern authorities.
Right. It lists fear, convenience, lust, abandonment, state permission, the massive profit-driven medical industry, or the ultimate modern idol, self-rule.
Self-rule.
Yeah. The child is placed under a death system instead of being protected under the boundary of life.
It's an aggressive historical synthesis, but it makes perfect logical sense within the author's framework of boundary architecture.
Because it's about the boundary, not just the specific method.
Exactly. You have an established boundary of life. Crossing that boundary to intentionally destroy a child is an abomination in this textual worldview, regardless of whether you package it in ancient religious ritual or modern clinical terminology.
Now, looking at this whole zoning map of boundaries, I have to push back with what I think is the most common ethical question of our era.
Okay, what is it?
If you walk up to an average person in 2026 and ask them for their supreme ethical standard regarding any bodily or sexual action, the answer is almost universally going to be mutual consent.
Oh, absolutely. Consent is the modern gold standard.
Right. As long as all parties are consenting adults, the action is considered morally sound. End of story. So, according to the internal logic of this text, to this Berean spine, is mutual consent enough to make an action morally right?
The text provides a definitive, unapologetic no.
A hard no.
A hard no. And it uses the specific prohibition of bestiality in Leviticus 18:23 to prove why consent cannot be the ultimate metric.
How does that prove it?
The author points out that the text forbids both male and female participation with animals. The reason this matters deeply to the author's structural argument is that it proves the entire chapter isn't operating on the axis of consent.
Because, quite obviously, an animal cannot offer legal or moral consent.
Exactly, but the author's point goes much deeper than just the capacity to consent. The argument is that the fundamental ethical question in Scripture is not, did someone want this? Or did two people agree to this?
What is the question then?
The ultimate question is, did God order this?
Did God order this?
Yeah, in this framework, human desire alone does not have the authority to define or move the sexual boundary. As the author states, desire can desire disorder. Consent can still consent to disorder.
Consent can consent to disorder. That right there is the epicenter of the earthquake.
It really is.
That is the exact point of impact between modern secular ethics and the ancient framework of this text. Because the modern view says, my body is entirely mine. It is my property to do with as I please, provided I don't harm another non-consenting adult.
Right.
But the author says explicitly, the body is not self-owned clay for limitless self-invention. The body belongs to God's created order.
It is a total, radical rejection of modern individual autonomy.
Yes, it is.
In the author's view, your body is not a blank canvas waiting for you to paint your identity onto it. It is a created, intentional form with a specific, divinely ordained purpose and architecture.
Going back to the building.
Yeah, you don't own the building, you are just inhabiting it, and you're obligated to follow the original architect's rules for its use and maintenance.
And this concept, that the body is not self-owned clay, this forces the author's argument to break out of the private bedroom.
Oh, absolutely.
We're no longer just talking about private consenting acts behind closed doors. The argument scales up. It moves into the public square, addressing how an entire society presents bodies, how it alters them, and how it profits from them.
Yes, to build this larger civilizational argument, the author moves out of Leviticus and into Deuteronomy.
Okay, what's in Deuteronomy?
Specifically, the text examines Deuteronomy 22:5, which is a verse that explicitly forbids men and women from wearing each other's garments.
Okay, I have to stop you here because I can immediately hear our listener throwing their hands up.
Right, the clothing verse.
Yeah, are we really going to spend time arguing about who gets to wear pants and who gets to wear a skirt? It feels incredibly petty.
It does sound like that at first glance.
Right, it feels historically subjective. Like, Scottish men wear kilts. Ancient men wore tunics. I mean, high heels were originally invented for male cavalry riders. Fashion is fluid. So how does the author handle the obvious historical relativity of textiles?
The author is actually highly aware of that exact modern critique and addresses it head-on.
Okay, good.
The text states, the point is not cheap fabric policing, as though every cultural clothing distinction across history is eternally identical.
Okay, so it's not about the literal threads.
No, the author isn't arguing that God mandated a universal, eternal uniform where men wear trousers and women wear dresses. The argument is entirely about what the presentation signifies within its specific cultural context. The text calls the verse a warning against sex boundary confusion.
Sex boundary confusion. So it's not an argument about the physical threads, it's an argument about the intent of the wearer.
Exactly.
The text says it calls out the intentional crossing, masking, or confounding of male and female presentation in a way that violates the given order.
Let me borrow your architectural blueprint analogy again, but let's tweak it to an electrical switchboard in the basement of that skyscraper.
Okay, I'm with you.
Imagine a massive societal switchboard with fundamental reality-based labels, male and female. The author is arguing that you cannot just walk up to the switchboard, tear those labels off, swap them around, or tape over them, because those labels signify an underlying, created biological reality.
The author explicitly says male and female are not costume categories to be swapped for self-expression against created order.
They're realities.
Right. Doing so is not just a passing fashion statement or a harmless exploration of identity. It is, in the author's chilling words, a symbolic overthrow of male and female order.
It's an outward rebellion.
Yeah, an outward bodily rebellion against the architectural reality God established way back in Genesis.
And the author makes sure to expand this beyond just fabric.
Right, it's broader than that.
The text mentions clothing, gear, public presentation, and bodily signification. It is a direct, uncompromising counter to the modern academic idea that gender is purely a social construct or a performative act that can be detached from biological sex.
Because in this framework, the biology and the presentation are linked.
The author says that treating males as females, or females as males, deliberately blurs created distinction and treats the architect's order as disposable.
The author then brings in another piece of historical evidence from Deuteronomy to show how these bodily rebellions don't just stay individual, they become institutionalized.
Yeah.
The text points to Deuteronomy 23:17, which talks about cult prostitution.
And here again, we see the author's absolute demand for translation integrity.
What's the translation issue here?
The author notes that older English translations sometimes use the word sodomite in this specific verse, trying to force a connection to homosexuality.
Okay.
But the author points out that the actual Hebrew word is kadesh, which specifically means a cult prostitute, someone who engages in sexual acts as part of pagan worship.
And again, the author chastises their own side, saying, a Berean does not need fake evidence.
Right, don't force it.
A Berean does not smuggle every later helpful meaning into every older translation just to win an argument. I really respect the intellectual rigor here. If the word means cult prostitute, you must translate it as cult prostitute.
Exactly.
But why does a cult prostitute matter to this overall architectural spine?
Because it provides the historical proof that sexual sin and idolatry were historically inextricably joined.
Right.
It proves that sexual disorder isn't just something individuals do in secret out of weakness. It can be formalized, it can be ritualized, it can be religiously packaged and endorsed by a society.
The text notes, Israel must not make its sons or daughters into sacred sex instruments.
Yes.
So we are watching a terrifying progression unfold in author's logic here.
Very dark progression.
We started with the individual rejection of the created order.
Yeah.
Then we saw the historical, systemic degradation of women as property. Then the destruction of the unborn. Then the societal blurring of bodily presentation. And now the institutionalization of sexual sin through organized religion.
It just scales up and up.
The author takes this entire centuries-long progression and fast-forwards to the very end of the Bible, to the book of Revelation, to talk about what they call systemic sin.
This is where the author's argument reaches its absolute civilizational peak. The text stops looking at individual verses and highlights two massive ominous symbols in the book of Revelation: Jezebel in Revelation chapter 2 and Babylon in Revelation chapter 17.
Let's start with Jezebel. In the context of this essay, who is she and what does she represent to the author's framework?
So in Revelation 2, the church in the city of Thyatira is heavily rebuked by Christ for tolerating a woman referred to as Jezebel.
Okay.
The text describes her as someone who claims prophetic authority and uses that false spiritual authority to teach and seduce servants into sexual immorality and idolatry.
So it's an internal problem.
Exactly. The author points out a devastating reality here. Revelation does not treat sexual compromise as merely an issue for pagan outsiders or secular culture.
It's an inside job. It's a rot within the church itself.
Yes.
The author says Jezebel represents false spiritual authority, teaching sexual immorality as if it were higher enlightenment.
Using spiritual language for it.
Yeah, there's someone claiming spiritual cover, perhaps using the language of love and inclusion to teach people to tolerate and celebrate what God's blueprint has already named as a structural abomination.
Exactly. The threat isn't just the secular world, it's the corruption of the legend from within the architect's own office.
Wow, that's a great way to put it.
And then the symbol expands massively with Babylon in Revelation 17. Babylon is described in apocalyptic terms as the mother of prostitutes and of the abominations of the earth.
The mother of abominations.
Yeah. The author argues that Babylon isn't just a city. It represents a whole civilizational system. It is the ultimate manifestation of where sexual immorality and abomination are seamlessly joined to global empire, luxury, idolatry, and economic corruption.
The writing in the text is incredibly vivid here. It says, whole systems can sell immorality. Whole economies can profit from bodies. Whole nations can make abomination into policy, entertainment, medicine, commerce, or religion.
It's totally encompassing.
We are no longer talking about individual choices. We are talking about the commodification of human flesh on a massive global scale.
The author is arguing that these are not isolated, private, disconnected sins. Abortions, sexual disorder, gender-boundary rebellion, the objectification of women, they all belong to a single, larger rebellion against created order, against life, and against truth.
They are interlocking cogs in a massive civilizational economy of abomination.
That is a staggering cosmic claim.
It really is. It takes everything we've discussed, the foundational definitions in Genesis, the strict boundary lines in Leviticus, the warnings about bodily presentation in Deuteronomy, and weaves it all into a single terrifying conflict.
All building up to Revelation.
Which leads us to ask, with all these specific ancient laws and civilizational warnings established, how does the New Testament manage to tie it all together? How does it summarize this massive history?
The author answers this by focusing intensely on two specific words used in the New Testament. The Greek word porneia, which is broadly translated in English as sexual immorality, and the concept of the abominable, particularly as it is used in the final judgments of Revelation.
Remember at the very beginning of this deep dive when we talked about empty containers.
Oh yeah, the empty containers argument.
The author said that modern dissenters treat words like porneia as empty vessels, waiting to be filled with whatever our current culture permits. To combat this, I want to use an analogy for how the author believes porneia actually functions in the text. Think of the word porneia as a digital zip file on your computer desktop.
That is a highly accurate way to visualize the author's linguistic argument, actually.
Let's hear it.
When you look at a zip file on your screen, it just looks like one single small icon. It seems simple. But when you double-click it, when you actually command the computer to unpack it, you find that the single icon contains hundreds of specific, incredibly detailed, distinct documents.
Right. The author is arguing that when Jesus Christ or the Apostle Paul used the Greek word porneia, it is not an empty file waiting for a modern update.
Not at all.
It is a massive, historically dense zip file packed with all the specific boundary rules from Genesis and Leviticus we just spent the last 45 minutes talking about.
The text explicitly states, porneia is governed by prior revelation. It gathers adultery, incest, prostitution, unlawful unions, sexual disorder, cultic sexual corruption, and all the acts God already called abomination.
So, to the modern liberal dissenter who says, well, Jesus never explicitly condemned this specific modern sexual practice. He only talked about broad sexual immorality.
The author has a devastating reply.
What is it?
The author says, Jesus didn't have to relist every specific act. He didn't have to waste time naming male with male intercourse or bestiality or child sacrifice every single time he spoke.
Because it was already gathered.
Yes. By using the gathered word porneia, he was double-clicking the zip file. He was invoking the entire weight of the Levitical holiness map.
And the author proves this by looking at the context of how Jesus actually uses the language in the Gospels.
Right, in the marriage debate.
Yeah, in the intense debates with religious leaders about marriage and divorce, Jesus doesn't treat sexual ethics as a vague, fluid category. He grounds marriage all the way back in creation. Male and female, joined by God, becoming one flesh.
It goes right back to Genesis.
Right. Porneia stands in direct definitional opposition to that creation marriage foundation. It is the ultimate covenant violation.
The author traces this zip file concept through the rest of the New Testament as well. Look at Acts 15, where the early church leaders tell the new Gentile believers to abstain from idols, from blood, from strangled things, and from porneia.
That's a very specific list.
It is. The author notes this isn't just a random list of behavioral suggestions. It's an exact intentional echo of the Levitical holiness boundaries: worship, blood, life, and sexual order.
And in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul explicitly says that the will of God is the believer's sanctification, specifically that they abstain from porneia.
Tying it directly to holiness.
Yeah, the author points out that Paul intrinsically ties bodily holiness to spiritual sanctification. You cannot claim to possess internal spiritual freedom while simultaneously rendering your physical body morally irrelevant.
But the author knows that relying solely on broad zip files leaves a little bit of wiggle room.
People will always look for a loophole.
Exactly. So the text pivots to show that the New Testament also utilizes incredibly specific, granular language. And the author focuses heavily on Paul's vice lists, specifically 1 Corinthians 6:9, to prove this point.
Yes, this is where the translation integrity of the essay shines yet again. In 1 Corinthians 6:9, Paul uses two very specific, highly debated Greek words, malakoi and arsenokoitai.
Let's take malakoi first.
Okay.
The author admits that malakoi is a difficult word to translate definitively because it literally carries the sense of soft.
Soft, like physically soft.
It can mean effeminate, but it can also mean morally soft or decadent. So the author says it must be handled carefully.
Again, the author refuses to exaggerate the evidence or force a meaning just to score points. But then we get to the second word, arsenokoitai.
Arsenokoitai is a completely different story. It is brutally direct.
Break down the etymology for us.
The author explains the deep etymology of the word, showing that Paul essentially invented a compound word built from two distinct Greek words, arsen, which means male, and koitai, which means bed.
So literally male bedders.
It quite literally translates to male bedders, or men who take other males to bed.
And the fascinating historical part is that Paul didn't just pull those two words out of thin air. He pulled them directly from the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament.
Right.
He pulled them directly from the Greek translation of Leviticus 18 and 20.
Exactly. Paul is taking the explicit legal prohibition of Leviticus and forging it into a single New Testament noun.
Wow.
And he uses this highly specific term again in 1 Timothy 1:10. So the author is establishing a comprehensive, impenetrable linguistic defense here.
The zip files and the specific files.
Yes. The New Testament uses broad gathering words like porneia, and it uses highly specific naming words like arsenokoitai. As the text eloquently summarizes, the broad and the specific are not enemies. They are the complete architecture.
This completely dismantles the modern argument that the Bible's broad terms are undefined and waiting for us to fill them.
It really does.
The author takes this final, undeniable logic and applies it to the very end of the biblical story, the book of Revelation. Revelation chapters 21 and 22 give a final cosmic list of those who are left outside the eternal city, the sexually immoral, murderers, idolaters, liars, and the abominable.
And the author preempts the critique here by pointing out that Revelation doesn't use the specific granular word arsenokoitai. It doesn't use modern clinical words for abortion or gender transitions. It relies on those broad gathering words.
But as we established at the very beginning, generalized does not mean undefined.
Exactly. The author's crowning, inescapable argument is this. If God already named male-with-male intercourse as an abomination in Leviticus, and if Paul already named male bedders as contrary to the gospel in Corinthians, then Revelation's broad final warning to the abominable undeniably carries that prior definition forward.
It pulls it all the way to the end.
It gathers the whole messy, rebellious history of humanity into a final, sweeping judgment.
The zip file is finally completely unpacked.
Right.
We have traced the entire architectural spine.
From beginning to end.
We started with the foundational definitions in Genesis. We moved through the structural, load-bearing pillars of Leviticus and Deuteronomy. We examined the tragic historical exchange in Romans, and we finally arrived at the civilizational collapse and final judgment in Revelation.
It is a highly rigid, uncompromising, terrifyingly consistent spine of judgment.
It is heavy. And as we transition to the end of our deep dive, we have to look at how the author wields this massive spine against the modern world.
Because it hits everyone.
It really does. I will tell you right now, this framework spares absolutely no one. The author directs specific, targeted, devastating warnings to almost every single faction in the modern cultural debate.
The text literally states, the Berean spine therefore cuts both ways.
It's a two-edged sword. Let's look exactly who it cuts. First, it cuts the liberal dissenter.
Right. To the progressive or liberal dissenter, the text says, you do not get to redefine porneia. You do not get to redefine abomination, life, or nature according to your modern comfort or your societal consensus. God already spoke. The dictionary is closed.
Then, the sword swings the other way and cuts the careless conservative dissenter.
Oh, this one is sharp.
To the conservative, it says, you do not get to reduce woman to sex, breeding, or male access, and then proudly call that natural use or traditional values. Genesis already spoke. Woman is ezer kenegdo. She is the face-to-face strength, not your property.
It cuts the abortion defender. It says, you do not get to blur the lines and equate the tragedy of miscarriage with the violence of abortion. Miscarriage is a death suffered under a broken world. Abortion is a death inflicted by choice. Natural death does not, and never will, justify intentional killing.
It cuts the sexual libertine, telling them, you do not get to separate your physical desire from the created order or separate your physical body from spiritual holiness. Your body is not your own.
It cuts the defender of gender confusion, stating you do not get to pretend Scripture is indifferent to male and female embodiment. The issue is not the fabric you wear. The issue is the willful exchange of sexed order into symbolic, cosmic confusion.
And finally, it cuts the translation manipulator. It tells the biblical scholar, you must be intellectually honest. If an ancient word means cult prostitute, you must say cult prostitute. If it means male betters, you must say male betters.
Don't hide the text.
Right. Do not lean on bad translation habits when they happen to help your argument, and then reject the original language when it violently confronts your modern sensibilities.
It is a sweeping, comprehensive, devastating critique of how modern humans interact with ancient, holy texts.
But I have to ask, because if this is where the essay ends, it sounds incredibly bleak.
It does sound like a giant crushing hammer.
Yeah. The author has built an ironclad architecture of judgment where almost everyone fails. Does the text just leave everyone crushed under the weight of the building?
No, and this is the most vital, the most beautiful caveat in the entire essay. The author doesn't end with judgment, they end with the gospel.
How they get there?
The text returns to 1 Corinthians 6. Remember when we talked about Paul listing all those specific sins? The porneia, the arsenokoitai, the idolaters, the greedy.
Right, that heavy vice list.
Paul doesn't end the chapter with that list. He writes a follow-up phrase that changes the entire trajectory of the theology. He says, and such were some of you.
And such were some of you. Past tense.
Exactly, past tense. The author emphasizes that Scripture does not name sin merely to crush the sinner. It doesn't build this massive, terrifying architecture of boundary laws just to dominate, shame, or destroy broken people.
What's the purpose then?
The author argues that the text names sin so that grace is not built on lies.
Oh, wow. The quote here is powerful. If sin is never named, washing means nothing. If guilt is denied, justification is emptied.
It's so true.
The author is arguing that if you take your cultural erasure and wipe away the boundaries, if you look at a person and say, well, what you are doing isn't actually a sin, the text is just outdated. You aren't actually being compassionate.
No, you're robbing them.
You are stealing from them the possibility of real, transformative restoration. You are offering them a fake peace.
The ultimate goal of this entire rigid boundary architecture is not condemnation, it is restoration. As the author concludes, the gospel answer to human brokenness is not denial. It is not objectification. It is not domination. It is not death.
What is it?
It is complete, holistic restoration.
That brings us full circle. Regardless of how you, the listener, feel about the specific political, social, or theological conclusions the author draws, the methodology here is undeniable and it is challenging.
The author flat out refuses to read a blueprint without consulting the original legend.
It is a masterclass in demanding internal textual consistency. The author forces the reader to confront the text on its own ancient terms, refusing to let modern vocabulary dilute or domesticate ancient definitions.
And that leaves us with a provocative final thought for you to carry with you today.
We started this deep dive talking about blueprints, and we talked about empty containers. I want you to think about the public debates we are having in our society right now.
All of them.
Yeah, not just about theology or sexuality, but about politics, economics, justice, or human rights. How often do we use massive, broad terms, words like freedom, justice, love, equity, or rights, and treat them as empty containers?
We do it all the time.
We secretly fill those massive words with our own cultural biases, our own personal comforts, our own unexamined preferences. And then we walk into the public square and expect everyone else to just implicitly agree with our hidden dictionary.
It happens constantly. It is the root of so much of our modern polarization. We use the exact same vocabulary words, but we are speaking entirely different, completely incompatible languages.
Because we're using different dictionaries.
Exactly. We are operating from entirely different foundational dictionaries. We are looking at the same map, but using different legends.
Exactly. This text, this Berean spine, challenges you to ask a very uncomfortable, necessary question. Who actually defined the words you're using?
That's the real question.
When you argue fiercely for a moral position, are you willing to trace the words you use all the way back to their absolute historical foundation? Or are you just carrying around an empty container, hoping no one asks you what's actually inside?
It's a question that demands rigorous self-examination, honestly, regardless of your worldview or your politics.
It really does. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly complex, demanding journey into the source material. We know it wasn't an easy map to read. Until next time, keep reading the legend on the blueprint and keep asking what the words really mean.